December 7th, 1944. The crisp winter air hung heavy over Aachen, the first major German city to fall to Allied forces. Inside a converted schoolhouse that now served as a makeshift medical facility, Nurse Elsa Hoffmann believed her duty was clear: tend to the German wounded, maintain her loyalty to her homeland, and endure the American occupation with silent dignity. Little did she know that by Christmas morning, everything she understood about duty, loyalty, and even humanity itself would be transformed by the words of a single American soldier. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the tale of how one unexpected connection across enemy lines revealed the profound truth that compassion can survive even in the darkest corners of human conflict. The makeshift hospital in Aachen operated in a strange limbo. The city had fallen to American forces in October, but the converted school still treated primarily German civilians and soldiers under the supervision of American medical officers. The arrangement was born of necessity rather than goodwill. With the German medical system in collapse and American field hospitals overwhelmed, this compromise allowed care to continue under strict Allied oversight. Nurse Elsa Hoffmann had been working at the hospital for 3 years. 26 years old, with auburn hair typically hidden beneath her nurse's cap, she had once dreamed of becoming a doctor before the war intervened. Instead, she had become known for her efficiency and composure, earning her the nickname the Ice Maiden from her colleagues. It was a title she neither encouraged nor disputed. "We need all hands in the West Wing," called head nurse Greta Weiss, a stern woman whose face seemed permanently set in an expression of grim determination. "The Americans are bringing in more of their wounded. They're overflowing their own facilities." Elsa looked up from the bandages she was rolling. "They're wounded, here." "Orders from Dr. Müller and the American captain," Greta replied with thinly veiled disapproval. "The fighting in the Hürtgen forest is worse than they expected. Their aid stations can't keep up." The Hürtgen forest campaign had been raging since September, a brutal battle of attrition in densely wooded terrain just east of the Belgian-German border. Even through the tight control of information, rumors had reached Aachen of the horrific conditions and mounting casualties on both sides. "When do they arrive?" Elsa asked, keeping her voice neutral. 20 minutes. Prepare beds in sections 4 and 5. Greta lowered her voice. "Remember who you are, Hoffmann." Elsa understood the implicit warning. Many of the German medical staff harbored deep resentment toward the Americans, whose aerial bombardment had reduced much of Aachen to rubble earlier that year. Some whispered of small acts of neglect toward enemy patients, not enough to be called sabotage, but enough to ensure German patients received priority in care. Elsa had never participated in such behavior, but she had not condemned it either. As predicted, within the hour, American ambulances arrived at the hospital's rear entrance. Elsa watched from a window as stretcher-bearers unloaded their cargo, young men in mud-caked uniforms, some unconscious, others awake but hollow-eyed with pain and exhaustion. "Hoffmann, take bed 17, Dr. Müller instructed, his voice raised to be heard over the commotion as the new patients were distributed throughout the ward. "Shrapnel wounds, fever. The Americans have already removed the metal, but the infection is severe." Bed 17 held a soldier who appeared to be in his early 20s. His skin had the grey pallor of serious infection, and his breathing came in shallow, rapid gasps. The chart clipped to his bed gave his name as Private Thomas Sullivan, 28th Infantry Division, blood type O positive, religion Catholic. Elsa checked his wounds, a series of angry, inflamed lacerations across his left side and leg. The American doctors had indeed removed the shrapnel, but the wounds were showing clear signs of advancing infection. She took his temperature, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, dangerously high. "You'll need penicillin," she said in English, not expecting a response from the semi-conscious man. To her surprise, his eyes fluttered open, startlingly blue against his ashen face. "Water," he whispered hoarsely. Elsa brought a cup with a bent straw to his lips, allowing him small sips as she had done countless times for other patients. Yet something about this interaction felt different. Perhaps because it was the first time she had provided direct care to an American, or perhaps because of the quiet intensity with which he studied her face as he drank. "Thank you," he said, his voice slightly stronger. "You speak good English." "I studied it in school," Elsa replied curtly, returning to her examination of his wounds. "Before the war." "Before everything," he murmured, closing his eyes again. Over the next several hours, Elsa divided her attention between her German patients and Private Sullivan. His condition deteriorated steadily despite the penicillin she administered. By evening, his fever had climbed to 105, and he had begun to drift in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling incoherently. During one of his lucid moments, he grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. "Where am I?" "Aachen. A hospital." His eyes widened with confusion. "But the nurses—" "You're German?" "Yes, this is a German hospital under American supervision. Your field hospitals were full." He processed this information slowly, his fever-addled mind struggling to understand. "So you're taking care of enemy soldiers?" "I'm a nurse. I take care of patients," Elsa said, the words coming out more defensively than she had intended. A ghost of a smile crossed his cracked lips. "That's decent of you." Decency had nothing to do with it. Elsa thought but did not say. She had been ordered to care for him, just as she had been ordered to do many things throughout this war. Orders were simpler than decency. Orders required no moral contemplation. As night fell, the hospital settled into its evening rhythm. The lights were dimmed, and the sounds of moaning and occasional cries subsided into a tense quiet, punctuated by the soft footfalls of the night nurses. Elsa was assigned the overnight shift, moving from bed to bed, checking vitals, changing bandages, and administering medications. She found herself returning to Private Sullivan more frequently than strictly necessary. His fever continued to rise despite the penicillin, and his breathing had become increasingly labored. The American doctor who had visited earlier that evening had examined him briefly and left additional medication orders, but his expression had been grim. Elsa recognized that look. It was the one doctors wore when they had done all they could and were preparing for the inevitable. Around midnight, Sullivan became delirious, thrashing weakly against the sheets and calling out names. "Mum, Liam, Captain Rogers." Elsa placed a cool cloth on his forehead and spoke softly, attempting to calm him as she would any patient. She found herself wondering who these people were. Family members, perhaps, or fellow soldiers. People waiting for him to come home. Near dawn, Sullivan's eyes suddenly opened, clearer than they had been for hours, finding Elsa's face in the dim light. "You're still here," he said, his voice barely audible. "Yes," she replied, checking his pulse. It was rapid and weak under her fingers. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. Elsa hesitated, then nodded. "I was so scared," he whispered. "Not of dying, but of dying with a German being the last face I'd see." He paused, struggling for breath. "Thought you'd be monsters. They told us you'd all be monsters." Something tightened in Elsa's chest. "And now? Now I see. Just another person, trapped in all this. Same as me." His hand moved weakly on the blanket, and without thinking, Elsa took it in hers. His skin felt burning hot against her palm. "I have something," he continued. "Inside pocket. My jacket. Can you—" Elsa looked around, locating the neatly folded uniform placed in the storage compartment beneath his bed. From the inside pocket of his jacket, she extracted a small, worn photograph. It showed a smiling woman with an infant in her arms and a toddler boy clutching her skirt. "My sister," Sullivan explained, his eyes fixed on the image. "Her kids, the little one. I've never met him, born after I shipped out." Elsa studied the photograph, the woman's open smile, the children's innocent faces. She had seen many photos like this one, carried by German soldiers who passed through her care. Universal tokens of what waited beyond the war, what might be protected or lost. "They live in Philadelphia," Sullivan continued. "Margaret Sullivan Richards, 125 Oakmont Street." He looked at Elsa with sudden urgency. "Could you write to her? Tell her I didn't die alone or afraid? The request stunned Elsa into silence. The idea of corresponding with an American family after the war seemed impossibly remote, even inappropriate. Yet the simplicity of the human need behind it, to have one's final moments witnessed, to have word sent to loved ones, was something she understood intimately. "I will try," she said finally, though she knew the promise might be impossible to keep. International mail between former enemies would likely be restricted for years if it was allowed at all. Sullivan nodded, seeming to accept both her promise and its limitations. "Thank you." His eyes drifted to the window, where the first grey light of dawn was beginning to appear. "You know what's strange? I was supposed to be a teacher, history. You?" "A doctor," Elsa replied, surprised by her own candor. "I was in my first year of medical training when the war started. We might have been colleagues," Sullivan said with a faint smile, "in a different world." "Perhaps," Elsa acknowledged, though the idea seemed fantastical, Americans and Germans working alongside one another as professionals, as equals. The war had made such possibilities seem like naive dreams. Sullivan's breathing became more labored, and Elsa adjusted his pillows to ease his distress. As she leaned over him, he spoke again, his voice now barely a whisper. "My mother always said, Hugh, hate makes the world smaller, love makes it larger." He drew a rattling breath. "I don't hate you. I don't even know you, but I'm glad. It's you here, not a monster, just Elsa." She hadn't realized she had told him her name. Perhaps she had, or perhaps he had seen it on her identification badge. It didn't matter now. "Rest, Private Sullivan," she said softly. "Thomas," he corrected. "Or Tommy. Nobody calls me Private Sullivan except officers." "Rest, Thomas," Elsa amended. He closed his eyes. "Will you stay? Just a little longer?" "Yes," she said. "I'll stay." And she did, holding his hand as his breathing grew more shallow. As the medication she administered failed to reduce his fever, as the infection that had taken hold in the cold, wet forests continued its relentless advance through his body. Shortly after 7 in the morning, Thomas Sullivan died. Elsa recorded the time of death in his chart with the same clinical precision she had used for countless patients before him. But as she drew the sheet over his face, she found herself whispering, "Goodbye, Thomas," an acknowledgement she rarely offered to those who passed under her care. She placed his photograph in her pocket, unsure what regulations dictated about personal effects of enemy soldiers, but certain that this at least should not be sent to some American military warehouse with his other belongings. This belonged with his family. Throughout the rest of her shift, Elsa continued her duties with her customary efficiency, but her mind kept returning to Sullivan's words. She had been trained to see Americans as enemies, aggressors who had brought destruction to her homeland. The propaganda had portrayed them as greedy, uncultured barbarians bent on German humiliation. Yet Sullivan had feared the same about her, that she would be a monster. They had each been prepared to see the worst in one another, and instead had found only shared humanity. When her shift ended at noon, Elsa did something unprecedented. Instead of returning directly to the nurses' quarters for sleep, she detoured to the hospital chapel. The small room had survived the bombing relatively intact, though the stained glass windows had been replaced with plain glass after the originals had shattered. Elsa sat in the back pew, the photograph of Sullivan's sister and nephews in her hand. She was not particularly religious, but the chapel offered something rare, a quiet place for reflection undisturbed by the constant demands of the ward. Here, she allowed herself to consider what Sullivan had said about hate making the world smaller. She thought about how easily she had accepted the division between German patients and enemy patients, how she had stood by while colleagues made their subtle distinctions in care. Elsa was startled from her thoughts by the arrival of Chaplain Weber, an elderly man who had served the hospital's spiritual needs since before the American occupation. "Nurse Hoffman," he greeted her with mild surprise. "I don't believe I've seen you here before." "I'm not staying," Elsa said, rising quickly. "Something troubles you?" the chaplain asked gently. Elsa hesitated. "A patient died this morning, an American. The chaplain nodded without judgment. "And this affects you differently than your other patients?" "He asked me to write to his family," Elsa explained, "to tell them he wasn't alone." "A reasonable request." "Is it? They're Americans." Chaplain Weber considered this. "The Americans are now our governors, for better or worse. Soon they will be neither our enemies nor our friends, but simply people with whom we must rebuild a world." He gestured to the chapel around them. "Even Christ said to love your enemies." "I don't love them," Elsa said sharply. "No," the chaplain agreed, "but perhaps you can see them as this young man asked you to see him, not as a monster, but as another person trapped in the same terrible circumstances as yourself." Elsa looked at him in surprise. "You were there?" "No," the chaplain said with a small smile. "But yours is not the first such conversation in this war, nor will it be the last. When people face death, they often see beyond the boundaries we construct in life." He left her then, moving to the front of the chapel to prepare for midday prayers. Elsa remained for a moment longer, considering his words and Sullivan's. Finally, she tucked the photograph back into her pocket and left. In the days that followed, the hospital received more American wounded, as the fighting in the Hurtgen forest intensified. Elsa found herself assigned repeatedly to the sections housing these patients, perhaps because of her English skills, perhaps because head nurse Weiss had noticed her particular attentiveness to Sullivan. Among these new patients was a sergeant named James Miller, a broad-shouldered man with a fragment wound to his shoulder, who watched the German staff with unconcealed suspicion. "Why are you helping us?" he demanded of Elsa as she changed his bandage. "We're the ones who bombed your city." Elsa continued her work without pausing. "I'm a nurse. You're a patient." "That simple, huh?" Miller scoffed. "Yesterday we were shooting at each other. Today you're playing Florence Nightingale." Elsa secured the fresh bandage before responding. "A soldier in this bed died 3 days ago. Private Thomas Sullivan. Did you know him?" Miller's expression changed. "Tommy? 28th Division?" When Elsa nodded, he continued, "Yeah, we came up through France together. Good kid, always talking about becoming a teacher after the war." His voice softened. "So he didn't make it?" "No," Elsa confirmed. "But he died worried about what his sister would think, if she would know he wasn't alone." She found herself adding, "He was concerned about dying with a German face being the last he saw. He thought we would be monsters." Miller studied her with new interest. "And what did you think about us?" "The same," Elsa admitted. "That you would be monsters." A strange half-smile crossed Miller's face. "And now? Now I think perhaps we have all become whatever this war needed us to be," Elsa said. "And perhaps we can choose to be something different." Miller nodded slowly. "Tommy always was a good judge of character." After a pause, he added, "His sister's name is Margaret, lives in Philadelphia." "I know," Elsa said. 125 Oakmont Street. He asked me to write to her." "And will you?" "I don't know if it will be permitted," Elsa replied honestly. "But I will try." As Christmas approached, an uneasy truce settled over the hospital. The German and American staff maintained their separate hierarchies, but the rigid divisions began to blur at the edges. A young American doctor consulted with Dr. Miller about treatment protocols for trench foot. German orderlies and American medics exchanged cigarettes and small talk in broken English and fractured German. On Christmas Eve, Elsa worked the night shift again. The ward was decorated sparsely with pine branches and homemade paper stars, a modest acknowledgement of the holiday. Around midnight, she was surprised to see Chaplain Weber enter the ward, accompanied by 3 nurses and an American chaplain. "We thought we might offer a small service," Weber explained, "for those who wish to participate. Some carols, perhaps, and a prayer for peace." The impromptu service began quietly, just the chaplains and nurses at first, but as they sang Silent Night, first in German, then in English, patients began to join in. German civilians, German soldiers, American GIs, each in their own language but following the same melody. Elsa found herself standing between beds occupied by a German lieutenant and an American corporal, both singing hoarsely but with unexpected feeling. Afterward, as she continued her rounds, Sergeant Miller called her over. "That was something else," he said. nodding toward where the chaplains were still moving from bed to bed, offering individual prayers or simply conversation to those who wanted it. Never thought I'd be singing carols with Germans. It's just a song, Elsa said, checking his chart. Maybe, Miller agreed. Or maybe it's a reminder. He reached into the drawer of his bedside table and pulled out a small notebook and pencil. Here, write down Tommy's sister's address for me. When I get back to the States, I'll make sure she knows about him. About you. Elsa hesitated only briefly before writing the address in the notebook. As she handed it back, Miller added, Tommy would have appreciated that service. He was always talking about how people are more the same than different, once you get past the uniforms. He mentioned something similar to me, Elsa acknowledged, about hate making the world smaller. Miller nodded. That sounds like him. College boy philosophy. Used to drive the other guys nuts with it. His expression grew more serious. You know what's crazy? I've been laying here thinking how if we'd met Tommy in the forest instead of here, we'd have shot at each other without a second thought. But put us in hospital gowns, and suddenly we can sing the same songs. The uniforms make it easier, Elsa agreed, to see the enemy instead of the person. And what do you see now, Nurse Hoffman? Elsa considered the question carefully. I see patients, some of whom will return to being soldiers, and then perhaps someday just people again. People, Miller repeated thoughtfully. Yeah, I think Tommy would have liked that answer. As Christmas morning dawned, Elsa completed her shift and prepared to hand over to the day nurse. Before leaving, she checked on Miller one final time. Merry Christmas, Sergeant, she said formally. Merry Christmas, Nurse Hoffman, he replied, then added, You know, after all this is over, really over, I mean, you should still write to Margaret. Tell her about Tommy's last hours. It would mean a lot to her. Perhaps I will, Elsa said, though the future still seemed too uncertain to make such promises. On her way out, she passed the hospital administrator's office and was surprised to hear her name called. Inside, she found Captain Harrison, the American medical officer overseeing the hospital. Nurse Hoffman, he said, gesturing for her to enter. I wanted to speak with you before you went off duty. Elsa stood at attention, unsure what to expect. Captain Harrison was known to be fair but strict in his oversight of the German medical staff. I've been receiving reports about your work with our men, he continued, all quite positive. Your English skills have been particularly valuable. Thank you, sir, Elsa replied cautiously. We're establishing a new field hospital closer to the front next week. I'm assembling a mixed staff, American and German. Would you be willing to transfer there? The work will be harder, but frankly, we need nurses with your skills and... He paused, searching for the word. Your perspective. My perspective, sir. Several of my men have commented that you treat American patients with the same care as Germans. That shouldn't be remarkable, but unfortunately it is. He studied her thoughtfully. Private Sullivan's case was apparently quite impactful for a number of people, including Sergeant Miller. Elsa felt a flush of surprise that Sullivan's death had rippled outward in this way. I was simply doing my job, Captain. Perhaps, but how we do our jobs matters, Nurse Hoffman, particularly now, when we're all trying to remember how to be something other than enemies. He handed her a transfer document. Think about it. Let me know your decision by tomorrow. Elsa took the document automatically, her mind racing with the implications. A mixed hospital would mean more direct collaboration with Americans, more opportunities to use her medical training, perhaps even a chance to learn new techniques. But it would also mean leaving the familiar environment of Aachen, working even more closely with those she had been taught to consider enemies. She left the hospital deep in thought, the transfer papers in one hand, and Sullivan's photograph still in her pocket. The city streets were largely empty on Christmas morning, many buildings still in ruins from the earlier fighting, yet here and there signs of life persisted, a child's face at a window, the smell of bread from a partially rebuilt bakery, an old man carefully sweeping debris from his doorstep. Elsa made her way to the small apartment she shared with two other nurses. Neither was home. Both had managed to secure passes to visit family in less damaged areas for Christmas. Alone in the quiet space, Elsa sat at the small desk by the window and withdrew Sullivan's photograph, propping it against a jar of pencils. After a moment's hesitation, She took out a sheet of paper and began to write. Dear Mrs. Richards, you do not know me, but I was with your brother, Thomas Sullivan, during his final hours at a hospital in Aachen, Germany. The words came slowly at first, then with increasing fluidity as Elsa described Sullivan's courage, his clarity even in fever, and the impact his simple humanity had made on those around him. She wrote about his wish to become a teacher, his concern for his family, and the photograph he had carried of her and her children. She explained that she was a German nurse, but promised that Sullivan had received proper care and had not died alone or afraid. Your brother told me that hate makes the world smaller and love makes it larger, Elsa wrote toward the end of the letter. In his final hours, he chose to make his world larger, and in doing so, he expanded mine as well. I cannot send this letter now while our countries remain at war, but I will keep it safe until it can be delivered to you. He would want you to know that even here, so far from home, he remained true to himself and to the values your mother taught you both. Elsa signed the letter and carefully folded it, placing it and the photograph in an envelope that she tucked into her small box of important documents. Whether the letter would ever reach Philadelphia remained uncertain, but the act of writing it had clarified something for Elsa. The next morning, she reported to Captain Harrison's office and accepted the transfer. 2 days later, she departed for the new field hospital with a mixed group of German and American medical personnel. As their transport moved eastward toward the shifting front lines, Elsa found herself seated beside an American nurse named Catherine Brown. First time working with Germans, Brown commented, her tone somewhere between friendly and cautious. First time working officially with Americans, Elsa replied with similar caution. Brown smiled slightly. Guess we'll figure it out together then. Elsa nodded, thinking of Sullivan's words about people being trapped in the same circumstances. I suppose we will. 3 years later, in the spring of 1948, Elsa Hoffman stood on the steps of a modest house on Oakmont Street in Philadelphia. The letter she had written on Christmas Day 1944 was in her hand, now accompanied by additional pages documenting her experiences at the Mixed Field Hospital, her eventual work with refugee services after the war, and her decision to accept an opportunity to train at an American hospital as part of a professional exchange program. She had arrived in America just 2 weeks earlier, one of a small group of German medical professionals selected for the program. When her supervisor had learned of her connection to the Sullivan family, he had arranged for her to have a free weekend to visit Philadelphia. Elsa hesitated before knocking, suddenly uncertain. Perhaps it was too late. Perhaps the family had moved on, had no desire to revisit the pain of their loss. Perhaps they would resent a German appearing on their doorstep, regardless of her role in Thomas's final hours. Before she could decide, the door opened, revealing a woman whose face Elsa instantly recognized from the photograph. Older now, with faint lines around her eyes, but unmistakably Margaret Sullivan Richards. "Can I help you?" Margaret asked, then paused, studying Elsa's face with growing curiosity. "Mrs. Richards," Elsa began, her carefully practiced English momentarily failing her. "My name is Elsa Hoffman. I was with your brother Thomas when he died in Aachen. He asked me to tell you that he wasn't alone." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in shock and then filling with tears. "You're the German nurse, the one Sergeant Miller wrote to us about?" Elsa nodded, surprised. "He wrote to you?" "In 1945, after he got home." Margaret reached out, taking Elsa's hand. "Please, please come in." Inside, Margaret introduced Elsa to her husband Robert and their children, 7-year-old Michael and 5-year-old Thomas, named for the uncle he had never met. The family welcomed her with a warmth that left Elsa temporarily speechless, ushering her into their living room, where photographs of Thomas Sullivan stood prominently on the mantelpiece. "We've always wanted to thank you," Margaret said, wiping away tears. "Sergeant Miller told us how you cared for Tommy, how you were with him at the end. It meant everything to us to know he wasn't alone, that someone was kind to him." "He was kind to me," Elsa replied, finding her voice again, "when he had every reason not to be." As she shared the letter she had written years earlier and told them about her experiences after that Christmas in Aachen, Elsa reflected on how profoundly Sullivan's simple act of human recognition had altered her path. The transfer to the mixed hospital had led to work with international medical teams, then to refugee relief efforts, and now to this exchange program that would allow her to finally complete her medical training, the dream she had abandoned when the war began. "Tommy always said he wanted his life to matter," Margaret said softly, holding the letter Elsa had brought. "I think he would be amazed to know how much it did, even at the very end." Later that evening, as Elsa prepared to return to her temporary lodgings in the city, young Thomas approached her shyly. "Did you really know my Uncle Tommy?" he asked. Elsa knelt to meet his eyes, seeing in them the same striking blue as his uncle's. "I did. Only briefly, but I remember him very well. He was brave and kind, even when it was difficult to be either." The boy nodded solemnly. "Mum says I'm named after him, so I'll remember to be brave and kind too." "That's a wonderful reason to be named after someone," Elsa said, smiling. "And do you know what your uncle told me? He said that hate makes the world smaller, but love makes it larger." "What does that mean?" the boy asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. Elsa considered how to explain such a concept to a child. "It means that when we decide not to see someone as an enemy, but as a person instead, the world becomes a bigger, better place with more possibilities for everyone." Thomas seemed to contemplate this seriously before nodding. "I think I understand. Like how you were supposed to be enemies, but instead you became friends." "Yes," Elsa agreed, touched by the simplicity of his understanding. "Exactly like that." As she bid farewell to the Sullivan-Richards family, promising to visit again before returning to Germany, Elsa reflected on the extraordinary chain of connections that had brought her to this moment. A German nurse standing on an American porch, welcomed as a friend by a family that, by all the logic of war, should have regarded her as an enemy. It had begun with a dying soldier's whispered words, a moment of human recognition amid dehumanizing conflict. The world was indeed larger than she had once believed possible. And within that expanded world, Elsa Hoffmann, once known as the Ice Maiden of the Aachen Hospital, had found not only a professional path forward, but a profound understanding of what it meant to recognize the humanity in others, even across the lines that wars and nations drew between people. In the years that followed, as she completed her medical training and eventually established a practice that specialized in treating children affected by war trauma, Elsa maintained her connection with the Sullivan family. Young Thomas grew up calling her Aunt Elsa, an honorary title that transcended nationality and history. Margaret's children and later grandchildren would visit Germany, staying with Elsa and hearing the story of their uncle who, in his final act, had helped bridge the divide between former enemies. In 1965, on the 20th anniversary of the end of the war, Elsa was invited to speak at a medical conference in Philadelphia on the long-term health impacts of conflict. In the audience sat Margaret and her family, alongside James Miller, now grey-haired but still recognizable to Elsa. After her presentation, Miller approached her with a warm handshake. "Dr. Hoffmann," he said with a smile, "Tommy would have been proud." "Of which part?" Elsa asked. "All of it," Miller replied simply. "The doctor part, the healing part, but mostly the part where you remembered what he said about making the world larger." As Elsa embraced her old patient and the family that had become her own across an ocean of difference, she knew that Thomas Sullivan had been right. Hate had indeed made their world smaller during those dark years of war. But what he could not have foreseen was how profoundly his own act of recognition, seeing a person instead of an enemy, would expand that world for decades to come, creating connections that would touch not only his own family, but countless others through Elsa's work. In a converted schoolhouse in Aachen during the winter of 1944, a dying American soldier had whispered words that changed a German nurse forever. And through her, those words continued to echo, making the world larger, one human connection at a time. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.